So in this video, we're going to look at a review for Unit 2, which is market structures and consumer and firm theory, or theory of the firm, theory of the consumer. So we started with, in Unit 2, is largely looking at consumer theory. And in this chapter, we looked at what is the goal of a consumer. And we saw that their goal is going to be to maximize utility. And utility, we define, and I believe we mentioned this in Unit 1 for a little bit, but utility is going to be the joy, satisfaction, or usefulness, whatever your favorite word would be for along those lines, joy, satisfaction, usefulness that one gets from either taking an action or consuming a good. So when we say take an action, there's some things that maybe don't necessarily aren't reflected in the market or aren't reflected by consumption of a good. So if I choose to go walk around my block, right? I'm not paying anybody to do it, and it's not necessarily a market transaction, but it's an action I took, and maybe that gives me some utility, right? So that's kind of what I'm referring to by that action or consuming a good. This is a little more straightforward. If I go out and I buy something, what joy does that give me? And we saw with utility is oftentimes we'll measure this in dollars, but there are other times where it can be measured in just nothing, right? So when we think about utility, what we'll do is we'll say, well, suppose that we said that we had a table, so we have utility from, say, consumption. And on one side, we have our quantity of, say, coffee and our total utility for coffee. Then suppose we have our quantity of cake, and then we'll have our total utility for cake. And suppose that for coffee, we have 1, 2, 3. And then for cake, we can also consume 1, 2, or 3 of it. In coffee, suppose we have like a 10, 15, 18. In cake, we have something like 8, 15, and 20. 8, 7, 5, 5, 3. Cool. So what we may run into is say, what is our utility if we consume, say, 2 cakes and 1 coffee? Right. We may run into something like that. And for this case, what we'll do is we'll say, well, keep in mind this chart is showing us total utility. So we can consume either 10 coffee, or we're consuming 2 cakes, which gives us 15 and 10 utility. So 2 cakes brings us 15 utility, 1 coffee brings us 10 utility. So utility in this case is 25. So just an example. And again, that's not necessarily dollars. It's a common kind of arbitrary thing we have is utils. But utils, they can mean different things to different people. And they're mostly in and of themselves. That means absolutely nothing. But if we have something to compare it to, then we have a little bit more fun to do. So in utility, that's the main thing we're looking at, is if you're given something, be able to work it out. So next little bit we looked at in Unit 2, and I really didn't emphasize that part on the exam. But the next part we get to is we start getting into theory of the firm. And the first chapter of this was largely looking at costs that a firm is going to face, or costs that a firm faces. And the first thing we thought about with this was just getting some definitions down. And for 3 big ones we looked at were revenue, cost, and profit. So our revenue, if we remember, our revenue was equal to our price times our quantity, and this was equal to the amount of money that we bring in while producing a good. I'm going to say via sales. Right. So if I sell a good for $10, I make $10 off that good. My revenue is $10. At this point, we don't have necessarily, we haven't talked about cost yet. So revenue only thinks about what is coming into the firm. So our costs is going to be it's going to be what a firm has to give up or pay, as we may otherwise think of it, to actually produce their goods. So the cost again, what the revenue says is what money do I bring in? The cost says what do I have to pay to produce this good? So this is going to be things like my material, my labor, maybe capital, stuff like that, tools, all that good stuff. And with costs, we ran into two types. We ran into the first was called implicit. And this implicit cost is going to be the opportunity cost of producing a good. Opportunity. So these are going to be costs. The key characteristic we'll see with these is these will not come up or will not come up in our balance sheet or in our books, we might say. So whereas I go out, or I'll just get into that, then go on to that example. So again, opportunity cost. So this is going to be the salary that I could have earned by doing something else. This is going to be if I'm paying something off or I'm putting money into or I'm putting money into somewhere, I also lose the money that I could have earned in interest or whatever the case is. The other type of cost that we have is called explicit. I'm going to give these a little bit of a highlight, that way they stand out a little more. But our explicit cost is going to be that cost, which I'm going to say requires an outlay of money. So these are things that I directly pay for, and I use my funds and I pay for these goods. So examples of this will be things like if you pay rent, your labor, materials, capital, stuff like that. And we'll note that these costs will show up in our bank account or in our books, is how I had it phrased earlier. So if I look at my bank account, I can see all the explicit costs that I've made and see that. Whereas on the other side, if I look at my bank account, if I go out and I buy a new drone, just say, right, I'm not gonna, and I suppose I pay for that drone with the money in my savings account, and my savings draws, I think, 1.5% today. Right, so if you have savings in a 1.5% online bank account, then if I pay for this drone with that money from savings, yes, I give up, say, $200 on the drone, but then I'm also giving up the interest that I could have earned on that $200. So if that's, say, 50 cents, that makes the drone 50 cents more. And as we go through time, that $200 being gone adds that implicit cost. So we have our explicit and our implicit cost as our two costs. Then the last thing we have is called our profit. And this is going to be our revenue minus our costs. And with profit, we're going to see, we're going to see two types of profit. The first is going to be called accounting profit. And this will be equal to our total revenue minus only our explicit costs. this is the profit that gets reported. So this is what the IRS sees, and this is going to be what an accountant will calculate. So we have accounting profit. The other type of profit we have is called economic profit. And this will be equal to our total revenue, again, minus our total cost. And our total cost, or TC, will be equal to our explicit plus our implicit cost. Explicit plus our implicit costs. And this is going to, again, since this includes those implicit costs, our economic profit is going to include our, basically what that means is it includes our opportunity cost. So as we go through, one of the things we noted is that our accounting profit will be greater than our economic profit, or equal to. That is, it could be zero, or excuse me, we could say that we have no opportunity cost, which works. So the next little bit we get into, so we have the revenue, yada yada. And excuse me. So what we want to think about is, so we have all this stuff going on, and we're thinking about costs. Often what we do is we just add them together or add our costs. So think about what is our revenue. A couple things that we got into. So when we think about the revenue side of things, we talked about our average revenue. And this would be equal to our total revenue divided by the quantity of goods we produce. We also talked about our marginal revenue. And for this one, what we'll do is we'll take our change in revenue divided by the change in quantity. Keep in mind this change in quantity and not just one, because there could be instances where our quantity takes relatively large jumps. So we just want to keep that in mind of how that works out. So we have change revenue, change in quantity, and same thing if we think about like costs. We'll sort of see the same thing. Our average cost will be equal to our total cost divided by the quantity of goods we produce, and our marginal cost will be equal to the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, which again is total cost 2 minus total cost 1 divided by Q2 minus Q1. And as we put these together, one of the overarching themes that we're going to look for throughout the entire, throughout this entire unit is our golden point, we might say. That is to maximize profits. We want to set our marginal revenue equal to our marginal cost. And really, that's where we want to be. That's our goal. If we find that point, we'll be able to maximize profits. And the reason for that is a little intermediate value theorem in math, if you're into that. If you're not, oh well. So that's really your golden point. And this is if you're ever in doubt, for the most part, I'm not going to say forever, but for the most part, if you're in doubt and you're not sure what point to pick, look for MR equal to MC. If you find marginal equal marginal cost, that about 99 out of 100 times will give you the quantity that you want to produce. So after we introduced all this stuff, we got into our different market structures. And the first one we talked about was a competitive market. So with the competitive market, uh, what we saw with this, or the characteristics that we saw, are one, we have many buyers and sellers. Two, our goods are identical. Across different sellers. So what this means is I am not able to distinguish between if one good is produced by Sally and the other by John, right? They're both the same, and there's no way to differentiate these goods. And the third thing that we'll see in this competitive market is that everyone is going to be a price taker. So everyone's a price taker, and everyone has what's going on, or everyone has to take the price that's given. So when we're thinking about this, again, when we're thinking about um, our competitive market, a couple things to note that in a competitive market, we'll see that our marginal revenue. So we said earlier that our marginal revenue is equal to the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. But if we look at what total revenue is, that's just price times quantity. So P2 Q2 minus P1 Q1 divided by Q2 minus Q1. But since everyone's a price taker, since we are price takers, we're too small to influence the market. So P2 is equal to P1, which we can just call P. So we get that this is equal to P times Q2. Oops, I'll make that 2 steps. P times Q2 minus P times Q1 divided by Q2 minus Q1, which gives us the price times change in quantity divided by the change in quantity. So our marginal revenue in a competitive market is just going to be equal to the price of the good. So for here, if we're trying to find the profit maximizing point, what we're going to want to do is set price equal to our marginal revenue. And then to find our profit, what we'll end up doing is we'll say that remember that our profit was equal to total revenue minus total cost. But if we work this out a little bit, we can divide both sides by the quantity, and we'll get that our average profit is equal to total revenue is price quantity over Q. Total cost is total cost over Q. Or let's rephrase it this way. Total cost is average total cost times the quantity over Q. So what we end up getting is that our average profit is equal to price minus average total cost. But then here, if we add a Q back to both sides, what we'll see is that our profit will come out to be the quantity of goods times price minus average total cost. So it gets everything in that nice per unit way to look at it, but we can find our profit. And I did work a little bit a roundabout way, but it works out all right, and in the end it worked out. So we're happy. So the next thing we're interested in, so we see how to calculate profits and all that. Oops. My notes went away. Okay, sorry about that. My notes ran away. So we have that figured out. And graphically, what this will all look like is something like this. So we'll have our price will be fixed. our average total cost we'll have a marginal cost that goes something like that. Our average total cost will go something like that. So we set MR equal to MC, which would be right up here, because this was marginal cost, average total cost, price is equal to marginal revenue. We have dollars and quantity of goods produced. So in this case, what we would end up seeing is that our quantity would be right here where MR is equal to MC, that's Q star. And we see that our the price of the good is right here. If we scroll down a little bit, we'll see where that quantity intersects the average total cost. That point shouldn't have been there, so it's going to happen now. There we go. So we'll see down here, this black dot is, we have our average total cost, and our profit will be this little area right here. And for the most part, this is our accounting profit. So when we think about what's going to happen what's going to happen in different scenarios. So if our price is greater than the average total cost, we're going to see that firms make a profit. But if firms are making a profit, then they're going to see that then this will lead to new firms entering the market. And when new firms enter the market, this causes our supply to increase, which leads to the price to fall. So if new firms enter the market, the price falls, and then our profits will shrink. However, if it's the other way around, and if our average total cost is greater than the price, then we see that firms will actually operate at a loss. And firms don't like that. So when I come in and I'm losing money every day, I keep losing money, what I'm going to end up doing is existing firms will want to leave the market. But this will cause my supply to fall, which will cause my price to increase. So either my profits are going to gain or my losses will shrink. So we see that we have these two cases. If prices are higher than average total cost, new firms enter. If prices are lower than average total cost, existing firms leave. So in a competitive market, in the long run, we are going to expect our profits to be equal to 0. And again, that's because more firms will enter if we're making a profit. Firms will exit if we're making losses. So that's where we're going to see that come up. And that's where we're going to end that chapter. So next little bit we get into is looking at monopolies. And monopolies are, again, this is a structure or a market structure with only one firm producing the good. Okay. So we only have one firm either producing or only one firm is producing anything similar to this good. So when we think about our monopolies, the big thing that we see, we have them because of what are called barriers to entry. And the two types of barriers that we are going to see, or the two types of monopolies that we'll see come up, are going to be our natural monopolies and our legal monopolies. And they are exactly what they sound like. So a natural monopoly is one that it's one that the market more or less creates by itself. Um, oops. Oftentimes caused by the cause of this will often be a high fixed cost, but a relatively low marginal cost or a low variable cost. So if you think about something like power or electricity, and this is the example I've used a lot in class. If you think about electricity, it's expensive to build a power grid, right? To get all the wires and to build the power plant, all that stuff, it's expensive. But to hook up to one individual house isn't really a big deal, right? It's just something you take a wire from the telephone or from the electric pole and you throw it on the house and then it works. And I know there's more to it than that, but for simplicity's sake, it's basically how it works. And even if you think about your own house or your own, or if we think about the college or anywhere, um, if I take my if I think about hooking up my computer or a phone to the school's chargers, it's fairly easy to do, right? You just plug one end of the building, plug the other end of your phone, and it's charged. However, to run new wires through an entire house or entire building is a fairly expensive process to do. So we have that thing with our nothing compared to making a power grid, but you kind of get the point. So we have our national monopolies. They happen by themselves. Um, I can rewrite that part a little bit by itself. And they just naturally occur, hence natural monopolies. Legal monopolies are going to be those established by um, those established by a legal entity. Primary reason for that would be the government would create these, but maybe we have something that causes this. And with our legal monopolies, the key things that we'll see with these is going to be first, we'll have a control of a resource. So, and understand that property rights are something that is legal. I have my property rights. So if I own all the diamond mines in the world, I have control over diamond mines, so I can, kind of decide what happens with it. Then we have, so we have control of the physical resource. Then the next thing that we had was our intellectual property laws. And there are three main things we saw with this. We saw patents, which a patent is basically says that it's out there to protect inventors with exclusive right to sell their good for some number of years. Or for a limited time, I might say. Then after our patents, we have a little more of the artsy side of things. So we have trademarks and copyrights. Trademark is the protection of a brand image or slogan or something like that. So if I come up and if I come out with a new restaurant and I use golden arches and my slogan is ba da ba ba ba, I'm loving it, right? The McDonald's would come after me and say, hey, that's our logo, that is our saying. If you do that, people are going to confuse you with us, and they're going to come to you thinking that you are us. If you've gotten to watch Tiger King, you know that at one point, Joe Exotic, he renamed his traveling show or his traveling thing to what was it called? What's she run? to Big Cat Rescue Entertainment Company like that, right? So when he did that, he got sued for doing that on a grounds of a trademark infringement, saying, "Hey, that is our name, and when you call yourself Big Cat Rescue Entertainment, people confuse you with us." So they had that issue. And then after a trademark, we have our copyrights. And what this is going to largely do is these are going to protect artists uh, and their work and their either image and their books, artist pictures with books, music, uh, and other pieces of literature or art. So again, copyright. If I come up with a new character, or I write a song, I write a set of guided notes, I do pretty much whatever I want to do. I have exclusive rights to that story or to whatever it is that we're talking about. I have the rights to that for, excuse me, I have the right to determine how that gets distributed for the rest of my life, plus about 70 years after I die. So my estate then gets to decide and gets to make money off their copyright. So with copyrights, we largely see it in music. So if you think about like YouTube, a lot of your content creators will say, and if you pay attention, a lot of your content creators will make sure that a song doesn't creep into the video, because if it does, the publisher or the recording studio will come after them and say, "Hey, you can't use that song because that's our song." Right? So then they have that, and they potentially get a copyright strike because the recording studio is going to say, "Well, our song made this video popular, so we get to take your money." And it's not hard to get them to make that claim. So you have patents, trademarks, copyrights. You'll want to be comfortable with them, and you'll be happy. So after introducing why we have monopolies, what we can look at is how do monopolies function. So we'll have our graph, and we'll have money on one end and quantity of goods on the other. And for the monopolist, things are going to be a little bit different. So we'll have a demand curve going down, something like that. But then we'll have a marginal revenue curve that takes its shape slightly underneath that demand curve. And the reason for that is, since the monopolist controls the market, if they lower prices or as they produce more goods, the price of every good goes down. So the price of every good goes down by more than the number of goods produced. So that marginal revenue just dips under the demand curve like that. And then they'll have a average cost curve that looks something like that. It's not too important. They'll have a marginal cost curve. They'll maybe look something like, whoops, let me fix this a little bit. So I'll have a marginal cost curve that looks something like this. And I'll have an average cost curve that looks something like this. And I like that better. Cool. So when we're thinking about a monopolist, the first thing we want to do is set our marginal revenue equal to our marginal cost. So the first thing is right here. Right, MR equal to MC. And what this gives us is our profit maximizing quantity. So this will give us Q star, which again is that profit maximizing quantity. Then from this point, everything we do is based off of that one quantity. So if we're saying what's the price they're going to charge, they're going to take this quantity and scroll all the way up to the demand curve. And this is going to give them the price that they should charge, or the profit maximizing price. You'll really want to be able to identify the price and the quantity in this case. Just do remember that we go all the way up. And then after we do that, we may be interested in what our average cost is. So we'll come here to our AC curve, and this will give us our average total cost. And if we take the area between price and average total cost and quantity, we'll come out with our profit. And again, it'll be this area right here. So just like the competitive market, our profit was still is again equal to the quantity of goods we produce times the price minus the average total cost. The key difference is our price and our marginal revenue are not the same thing. So you just want to keep that in mind because again, as we produce more goods, the price goes down. And the price goes down for every good. So the monopolist does not get to charge this person $10, $9, $8, and $7. Instead, at this point, the monopolist is charging everybody $7 or whatever that price we found to be is. So these are the key parts of the monopolist. And if you notice, we're kind of going a little bit in every chapter. It's because we have like 13, I think like 13 chapters or something like that, and 50 questions. So it works out to just a few questions per chapter. So if you notice I'm missing stuff, take that to mean what you want it to mean. But that could be beneficial for you in saying, hey, you don't have to worry about every single thing that we talked about throughout the entire course. And I don't want you all to be sitting focusing on every single thing we focused on, but you get the point. So the next chapter we looked at was the next one. And the next one we looked at was our imperfect competition. And we think of imperfect competition, we ran into two types of markets. The first was one that dealt with monopolistic competition. Monopolistic. There we go. Competition. And with the monopolistic competition, what we're looking at is, again, this can be a market where we have many sellers that are selling similar but not identical goods. And this not identical gives us into a thing that we call differentiation of our goods. And largely what differentiation tells us is just that, right? Am I able to distinguish two goods from each other? And for this, we had a list of, I'm going to encourage you to review and have handy the list of reasons or list of different, I guess, differentiators. Or that list, there was a list of things where it says, hey, these are how we can tell goods apart. And a few things that were on that list, we had like physical aspects of the product. So we had things that were actually physically different between two products. So if we take Coke and Pepsi, right, even though they're very similar, they actually have a different taste to them. If you take a McDonald's cheeseburger versus a Culver's cheeseburger, again, they're gonna prepare them in different ways. They're gonna just be different. Physically, they're different products, even though they're similar. Then we had our intangible aspects. So things that you can't necessarily tell just by looking at the product, but maybe there's something that makes you think the product is different, or maybe there's a matter of convenience. So our intangible aspects, we had things like location, maybe how you feel about the company, whatever the case is. So if you have two Casey's gas stations right across the street from each other, and they both sell gas for the exact same price, the one on the right side of the road is probably going to be more convenient to go to. So you'll probably more than likely turn right to get gas because even though there's no other way to distinguish them, the gas station on the right side of the road is easier to get to. So we have intangible, then we have perceptions. That is, if I think a good is high quality, I may be more likely to buy it than if I think it's low quality. And again, before we buy it, we don't have any way to tell what perceptions, well, by looking at the product, you can't tell what perceptions people have of it. So if you think about somewhere like if you think about like a fast food restaurant, right? And you've had a few bad experiences in a row at different certain chains of or certain franchisees of a chain. You might say, well, I just had these bad after bad after bad experience, so I don't want to go there because you just don't have a good perception of the product, even if the one that you skipped over would have been the best they've ever made. You have that idea which differentiates these products for you. So again, when we think about differentiation, they can uh, we can differentiate them based off of physical traits, but there can also be things that are more just in our heads that'll cause this. So also with the monopolistic competition, we're going to see that the monopolistic competitor will act like a monopolist, will act, will behave like a monopolist. So they act like a monopolist. And what this means is that they're going to set MR equal to MC, then and that'll give them a Q star, then find where the quantity is equal to the demand curve, and that'll give them the price. So they act exactly the same as a monopolist, but, or I might say except their demand curve is going to be more elastic or flatter than a monopolist. And the reason for this is say I prefer Coke to Pepsi, right? Even if I do prefer Coke to Pepsi, if the price, no matter what, when I go to the store, I want to buy a pop or I want to buy a soda product. But if the price of Coke jumps up to, say, $10 or $20 for a 12 pack, I might say, you know what? Yes, I want a pop, but at that price, I'm going to switch over and buy the other product. So because the monopolistically competitive market or competitor sees the demand for their good, the demand for a McDonald's cheeseburger is more elastic than demand for cheeseburgers in general, right? Just like when we talk about elasticity, anything like that, the more narrowly defined our good, the more elastic that good is going to be. So keywords again is that we have that their demand curve is more elastic or it's flatter than the monopolists. The other type of market we looked at with this was our game theory, or our oligopoly. And this is when we have a few firms that control a market. And then with the oligopoly, we got into a talk about what's called a duopoly. And this is when two firms are in the market. And we ran into this situation called the prisoner's dilemma. And with prisoner's dilemma, what we looked at is we see that both firms act in their own best interest. Or their own self-interest, but end up with a non-socially desirable outcome. So again, what this is looking at again, and what we saw with prisoner's dilemma was something just like that. So we had our two parties, right? They had a choice to either tell or not tell. And we'll suppose that we have Bonnie and Clyde. So they have this choice to either tell the other one or not tell. Then we have Bonnie, Clyde, and they each get a payout based off of what happens. And just let me get that format set up really quick. So we know if neither of them tell, they both get, say, 2 years in prison. And I'm just going to say 2 years. And we're referring to, and this one we're looking at prison time. So high numbers are bad. So if neither of them decide to tell, they can both get 2 years. But if one of them tells, so if Bonnie decides to tell, they say, well, if you go, you'll be set free. So you get 0 years, get set free. But then Clyde has to go in for 10 years. The same thing, vice versa. 10 years and 0 years. And we'll say that the deal of you telling is that if you tell, you get 2 years off your sentence. So by not telling, you go from 2 to 0. But if you both tell, this takes you to 8 years apiece. So as we were going through this, we saw that I'd rather, if I'm Bonnie, and I know that Clyde is going to tell, 8 years is better than 10 years, so I'll take 8 years. I'm just going to color code Bonnie. And if I know that Clyde's not going to tell, 0 years is better than 2 years. So I'm going to take 0 years. And same thing if I'm Clyde. If I know Bonnie's going to tell, I'd rather go for 8 years than 10, and I'd rather go for 0 than 2. So our socially desirable outcome is down here. Because 2 years, I mean, that's 4 years among both of us, but also 2 years is better than 10 years, and it's better than 8 years. However, we end up here at this Nash equilibrium. And this demonstrates prisoner's dilemma, right? Again, we want to be down here. We want to both say, oh yeah, I'm not going to tell. We're both going to cooperate. But at the end of the day, we both end up telling because I can't trust you, you can't trust me, and I'm a rational agent. So that's the issue with our prisoner's dilemma and where we end up. And this one doesn't really focus on the oligopolies too much, just because there's it just doesn't focus on them too much, because I had a lot of stuff that was outside of I had a lot of stuff that was my own going with the monopolies, so that's why that is. So that's the end of the second unit. I'm going to pause really quick and switch recordings over to start unit 3. But that's the end of the second unit, and I'm going to end that